Hi, class. Welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. It is a fine Monday morning to kick off our discussion of biotechnological applications and, in particular, bioengineering applications in medical contexts. Now, the Leon Cass reading for this week began with a poignant statement. And I just want to kick off our discussion just looking at this quote. Some transforming powers are already here. The pill, in vitro fertilization, bottled embryos or ectogenesis, surrogate wombs, cloning, genetic screening, genetic manipulation, organ harvesting, mechanical spare parts, chimeras, brain implants, Ritalin for the young, Viagra for the old, Prozac for everyone. End quote. So, what Cass is getting here is that over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen technological developments in the medical context that's not only reshaped medicine and continues to reshape and impact medicine, but has also greatly impacted society. So, the developments in biological sciences equal transformations of fundamental aspects of what it means to be human and concerning human reproduction. Pushes biological limits. We have the ability concerning designer babies for the first time to take hold of evolution and to choose which traits are passed on to future generations. And we can, in the realm of reproduction, help families who previously could not produce and individuals who previously could not produce children to be able to reproduce and to change the way that reproduction looks in our current society. So it's important to recognize the transformative power of these new biotechnologies, both within medicine and without. Now, today we're going to be looking at cloning, but we'll also be, as I said, discussing genetic modifications and, in particular, genetic selection, and we'll weigh human enhancement versus therapeutic applications. Concerning cloning, we'll look at the Savleshu piece where he wants to separate cloning for research purposes versus cloning for medical purposes because these bring up fundamentally different ethical issues. And then, of course, as I said, applications to food, and in particular, animal modifications for both food and for research purposes, and to the point where we could potentially bring back extinct species. As you might have watched some of the Discovery shows, etc., on bringing back the mammoth or the passenger pigeon, etc. So again, there is a transformative power to these technologies, and we'll be touching some of the key points of these transformations throughout the week. So today we'll just briefly go over cloning as a reproductive technology. We'll talk about some of the main ethical concerns, and then I will point you towards specific case studies that might be of interest to discuss in the discussion forum. So cloning, also called reproductive cloning, this specifically refers to the asexual production of a new multicellular organism genetically identical to another. And scientists have recently made major achievements with cloning in my lifetime and certainly in most of your lifetimes if you're younger than me, including the asexual reproduction of sheep, cows, mice, etc. Now, it's important to note that in humans and other animals, the genetic blueprint for an individual is in each of its cells. And I'm sure as you are all pre-med majors, or many of you are pre-med majors, pre-vet majors, going into pharmacy, etc., this comes as no surprise. But just for those who have not taken biology yet, just a pointer. And the clone contains the same genetic blueprint as the clone's progenitor. Now, clones are not new. They appear naturally in the form of identical twins. And scientists have been cloning both human and animal cells for research purposes for years. Now, It's also important to note that an animal or human clone is not a perfect copy of an individual, but simply shares the same genetic blueprint. So if you take a look at these cows, for example, all of these cows are genetically identical to one another. These are cloned cows, and they produce high protein milk. In particular, they're cows from a research program at Michigan State University. However, if you look closely at the picture, you can see that their markings, the black splotches or white splotches here, are unique. And that's to highlight how your genetic blueprint, genetic factors, only one factor in the actualization of specific traits. So you can have or be genetically identical and yet be a distinct organism. And the idea that two genetically identical people or animals, in the case of the cows, are carbon copies of one another is called the genetic fallacy. So we want to make sure that we don't fall into this type of reasoning. And this is the idea that genes make the person and that genetics determines all of an individual's characteristics. But as my students who are twins know, and I'm personally married to a twin, they regardless of the genetic material that is shared, there are each individual's can be and is very distinct, and various factors impact this. There could have been different nutritional values, different environmental factors, epigenetic impacts, different societal inputs, etc., etc. And these impact the development and the actualization of specific traits. So with that being said, in 1996, there was a breakthrough. Dolly was the first mammal cloned, and Dolly is named after what famous singer? Do, 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 do. Dolly was named for Dolly Parton. 1996, from an adult somatic cell using the process of nuclear transfer. And Dolly made the headlines. This was the first time that we were able to successfully create a clone. And as you can see, 1996 is relatively new. We talked about the development of IVF in the late 70s, and now fast forward 20 something years, and now we're able to create a new living being from a somatic cell. Right? And since the creation of Dolly, we've been able to successfully clone cattle, goats, pigs, cats, rabbits, mice, so many mice in the research context, etc., etc. So we've been refining the process and been successfully moving it to other animal models. Now, just to go over somatic cell nuclear transfer, to sort of set the stage for our discussion, it roughly includes 4 steps. First, you extract the DNA packed nucleus from an egg. You replace the egg's nucleus with the donor nucleus of an ordinary body or somatic cell, and from an adult individual, the one that you wish to be cloned. You stimulate the reconfigured cell with chemicals or electricity to start cell division, and then you transfer the cloned embryo to a host uterus. So it seems like a relatively straightforward process. I have a brief video. Hopefully, YouTube will recognize that this is for educational purposes, just showing you the process in action.
This video was prepared by my colleagues Dieter Egli and Kevin Hagen. And you see here on the left is what's called a holding pipette, which gently sucks on the egg. The egg is surrounded by a membrane called the zona. And you'll watch this pipette on the right first drill a hole into the zona, then go in and suck the nucleus out. And then another nucleus, which has been taken from, say, a somatic cell, a cell of the body, is going to be put in. So if we could start the video, please. You'll see now that this drilling pipette is going to drill a little hole into the membrane. You can maybe see a little bit of the hole right here at the next part. This pipette, you'll note, isn't really sharp like a syringe. There you can see a bit of the hole. And now the pipette's going to go in and remove the nucleus. And if you look carefully in the pipette, you'll see a line in the nucleus, which are all the chromosomes lined up. So that nucleus is going to be squirted out now because we don't need it anymore. And there we have an enucleated egg. Now the next step is to take a set of eggs like that, and I'll show you two, and then transfer into them a nucleus from another kind of cell, a fully differentiated somatic cell. So here the enucleated egg is set on the side, that it's held by this holding pipette on the left. There's drilling the little hole in the membrane. Here we go in. Here comes the nucleus from the right. The pipette goes in, and these pipettes are operated with a piezoelectric device. So you can't see it here, but it's like a little jackhammer going very quickly, like a Woody the Woodpecker, getting in there to then squirt the nucleus in. Here we'll see it again, a little hole in the zona is prepared, and now the nucleus is going to be squirted inside. So there's two examples of what's called somatic cell nuclear transfer.
Okay. Hopefully. Okay, so I wanted to show you the process because I think it's quite interesting to see it in action. But that is somatic cell nuclear transfer, and that is the basis for the ethical discussions that we'll be having today, the development of that process, and all of the implications or the scientific implications of said process. So ever since the creation of Dolly in 1996, just like the development of IVF, we saw a huge public discussion blossom around the potential impacts of cloning. So the creation of a genetic duplicate of both an adult mammal or human, if we're talking about potential applications of said technology, have provoked some of the most public attention to biotechnological applications that we've seen in decades. And this is indeed, I would argue, a precursor to the highly contentious debate concerning genetic modification, or at least an extension, because GMO technology has been discussed since the 80s, but it's gotten particularly contentious post-1990s. Now, both scientists and policy members have voiced serious ethical concerns concerning cloning. So I want to go over some of the public debate discussions and then to sort of set the stage for our wider discussion on Blackboard. Now, I do have a video discussing the development of Dolly, so I need to make a note. Now, Julian Savulescu, he's an Australian philosopher and bioethicist. He was enamored with this specific debate concerning cloning, and he argues that there are two specific areas that we need to separate in order to adequately identify and weigh the ethical concerns. So cloning is a reproductive technology, and as such, Savulescu argues that we should weigh it in the same or similar fashion that we would weigh any other art, such as IVF, surrogacy, etc. But cloning also is used extensively in research contexts as well, and so we should also discuss ethical issues that arise specifically within that context. So I just wanted to point to Savulescu's argument because I think he makes an interesting argument here, because yes, different ethical issues arise in different contexts, so we should be cognizant of that. And he also argues that the bioethical principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, informed consent, although as we talked about, that's connected to autonomy, justice, etc., should all play a major role in teasing out and answering the ethical questions in both of these contexts. Now again, there are several arguments for adopting cloning in the reproductive context, and there are several arguments against. So there's what's called the benefits argument. And this is the idea that for some, and again, we are looking from Savlachu's position, we are looking at this from a human reproduction perspective. So the benefits argument goes as follows, and it's the basic argument for all arts, right? There are some people who cannot reproduce or are having or have major issues reproducing. And so cloning as part of an additional suite in the sort of art or an additional arrow in the art quiver, so to speak, provides these people who are attempting to reproduce but are having issues with an additional avenue for producing a child. So some men cannot produce sperm, some women do not have eggs, and some parents could pass on some serious genetic diseases, or there could be some health risks involved. And for this subset of the community, cloning may be their only option or their only hope of having a child that's genetically related to them. So we could argue from a beneficence perspective here that cloning is important. Cloning technology is important because it could benefit this subset of the community in a large way, right? Additionally, there's the argument that parents who have lost a child and are suffering the pain from that loss could gain some hope and or some solace from potentially cloning their child. So they could to ensure that some part of the child lives on. But then again, we need to harken back to the genetic fallacy here. So we have beneficence and we have non-maleficence playing a role in both of these. We could also apply Robertson's procreative liberty position. If we agree that we have a fundamental freedom to reproduce or not to reproduce, and that this equates to a right to make reproductive choices without the interference of others. And remember, rights language is particularly strong. I have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a huge, that is a very powerful statement. For example, when you evoke rights language, you are stating also implicitly that someone has a duty to provide said or to ensure that said right is realized. So if we do accept this procreative liberty position and that there is a fundamental freedom and right to make reproductive choices, so autonomy here reigns supreme, right? Your choice to or not to, then we could argue that cloning technology should be applied in the human context and that indeed we should endorse said applications. So you could use the same argument. Premise 1, people have a basic right to reproductive liberty. 2, cloning is a reproductive technology covered under this right. Therefore, people have a basic right to cloning technologies. So with these three arguments, I'm curious what you think. Do they hold up? Should we accept Robertson's reproductive or procreative rights position? Should this position be applied to cloning? Should cloning technology be treated like another or additional art? Or is there something distinct from cloning that separates it from, say, IVF and surrogacy? All of these questions can, and I would emphatically argue should, be discussed. Now, Savlachu argues that yes, we do typically apply these four principles in both assisted reproductive contexts and in research contexts. And yes, we should begin our discussion with this. However, the principles themselves miss something. He's arguing that cloning is distinct from these other IVFs and as such, other arts. And as such, there is a deeper problem that we need to tarry with, that we need to engage with when we're talking about applications of cloning technology. And he argues that cloning violates the right of people to a unique identity. That there's this the genetic fallacy is being applied, and this sort of pushes back against the idea of families who are suffering the loss of a child, that solace could be found with the replacement, well, not replacement, but with the cloning of said child. So Savlashus argues that, a clone, be that a clone of yourself or a clone of a loved one, being born into a context where there are many sort of assumptions concerning likes, dislikes, what your future will look like, what your future will not look like. And this violates a person's freedom to be able to make choices and to guide their lives utilizing reason, because you're already sort of set on a path that was predestined for you, which impacts how you are developing your own unique identity. And indeed, the continuation of this argument is that it pushes or could push the trend for parents to live through their children. If you clone yourself, and then you'll be like, well, I wouldn't do that, so my clone surely wouldn't do that, or I have an interest in carpentry, and so my clone should be interested in carpentry. And so for Savlashu, actually, I would argue that for Savlashu, yes, this violates the right of people to a unique identity. But one could argue that this fundamentally pushes back against autonomy, right? Because if everything is seen to be predestined, if you're pushed on a particular path, then your choices are sort of limited. And if your choices are limited, one could argue that's a limitation of autonomy. So I'm not sure if the principles do not capture the main issue here. And again, I'm curious what you think. Is this an issue of autonomy, or is Savlashu right that this runs much deeper? And this idea that it sort of pushes parents to live vicariously through their children, he points to, evidence of this trend. There's already a push for kids to follow their parents' footsteps. If your parent was very good at a particular sport, you might be pushed to play said sport. If your parent went to a specific school, you might be pushed to go to the alma mater, or you might be pushed to go to another school that the parent had always wanted to go to, or you may be pushed to move into a family business. So think about whether or not you've had this experience, and do you think that cloning would exacerbate this problem? Or is this just sort of a red herring that Savlashu is focused on, but it's not really going to be an issue or a societal impact of technological application? And so this right to a unique future can also be understood as a right to ignorance, or a right to, a right to a unique future. I jumped ahead. And again, is this a right? Do we have a right to not know what's going to happen in the next chapter of our lives? Or do we have a right to a unique future? Aren't our futures already impacted by choices that our parents make, or by nudges that we receive as children? Is this something that's unique to cloning? Is it an issue that we need to address? And we could also talk about how the younger clone will potentially live in the shadow of the older clone. And again, if we have multiple clones, will identity play a role, or should questions of identity play a role in the applications of cloning and reproductive technologies? Okay, so then there are specific counter arguments against cloning to continue. So cloning is wrong because it's not natural. And we see this discussion in the genetic modification debate. So, for example, the modification of aqua advantage salmon, one of the critiques of this, because this is a transgenic application, meaning not only it utilized a different process, but also that different genetic material from different species were included in one organism. One of the big critiques is that it's not natural. right? It's crossing species lines. So, does cloning also fall within this category? So, the argument is cloning is wrong because it's not natural, not that it crosses species lines in this instance, but because it fundamentally impacts the way that humans reproduce. And one could argue that because it has these larger social and biological implications, uh, that there's something epistemically wrong with it. There's something almost ontologically problematic by impacting this natural order, so to speak. So, natural can be defined as occurring in nature or acting in accordance to one's function, to utilize an Aristotelian critique. So, does cloning fall within this category? And is naturalness an acceptable criteria for weighing the ethical impacts of said technology? Do we want to use this as sort of an additional principle, or does it fall short? So is cloning unnatural? And is this an adequate counter-argument or pushback to applying cloning technology? And again, as this plays such a huge role, as you'll see in the Dolly video, it's important to weigh this. What is natural? Does it have an ethical component, or is it simply an ontological discussion? And is naturalness something that we should be discussing here? Now, if we look at the major theories and apply these to cloning in addition to the four principles, utilitarianism, as we discussed throughout the semester, a utilitarian would argue that cloning and indeed any biotechnology would be acceptable if the benefits outweigh the harms. So again, look at all of the people who are impacted. If the benefits of applying said technology outweigh the harms of applying it, then the technology should be applied. So even if we look at the living in the shadow of the older clone issue, if the benefits of living a life free of, say, diseases or free of being produced because it is an assisted reproductive technology, so we're talking about helping families or individuals who could not produce children, if the benefits of that outweigh the harms of potential suffering, then a utilitarian would argue that cloning should be seen as an assisted reproductive technology and utilized and applied. Okay. So I have yes, there are so many case studies and so little time. Okay. So I have 3 case studies, although I'm only potentially going to put up the Dolly video. This one case study, I won't show you the clip. I'm sorry for clicking back and forth. But it is a press release by scientists working on this assisted reproductive technology. And there's a heated exchange because of the limited success rate. And you'll see that in the Dolly video, which is one of the reasons why I'm not going to show this. So it has at the time of this video, which is an older video, it definitely had under a 50% success rate. And it certainly, I believe, was under 20%. And as such, because we're talking about human cloning, we're talking about human embryos, the critique was, can you accept that? Can you live with that low of a success rate when we're talking about human reproduction? What should the success rate look like before it is applied to humans and in human medicine? And so forth and so on. So that brings up several important ethical questions. And I ask you to tarry with that question too. At what point in development should these technologies, or should they even, like more generally, or should they ever be applied to the human context? And should they be applied to the animal context as well? Is it acceptable to have a low success rate with these technologies, but be applied, in short. Additionally, cloning, like a genetic modification, has been, or biotechnology more general, has been applied in unique ways, such as potentially bringing back extinct species. So in this video, and I will put this one up, mammoths are being, hopefully, being brought back from extinction. Well, hopefully from the scientist perspective. So, should cloning technology be utilized in this way? Should we be bringing back extinct species? What are some problems? What are some benefits? And how do we determine which to bring back? And what would various other ethics say about this? So I'm going to leave you with these thoughts. We see various supports for, especially utilizing Robertson's reproductive liberties position for cloning, but there are also several concerns that are being brought up. So lots of good points to discuss in the discussion forum and on Friday. So I will leave you here as we are over 30 minutes of discussing cloning. And I'm looking forward to your thoughts and I'm looking forward to the discussion.